In 1980, a millionaire built a sperm bank stocked exclusively with Nobel Peace Prize winner sperm. His goal was to breed a generation of geniuses and save civilization. And what he did was produce over 200 children from the sperm bank. This video is the story of what happened to those children. The 1970s were a decade of Americans convinced that their country was falling apart. Crime climbing every year, and cities hollowing out. And somewhere in all of that noise was another very specific kind of anxiety which was brewing. And that was that the wrong kind of people were having too many children. And then one strange man decided to finally do something about it. His name was Robert Clark Graham. Graham is a 64-year-old optometrist from Michigan who made $100 million inventing shatterproof plastic eyeglasses. For his invention, he has made more money than he knows what to do with. And so he writes a book, which is called The Future of Man in 1970. His argument in this book is that for most of human history, nature was brutal, and this brutality kept the species sharp. The weak humans died young, and the slow got eaten. The unintelligent humans also made bad decisions and paid for them. So according to Graham, this wasn't cruel. It was simply the mechanism that built the human brain over ages. But modern civilization has switched that off. Medicine has kept the sick alive, welfare has kept the poor fed, and nobody was dying young anymore. At least, not for the reasons they used to. And the people that Graham called retrograde humans, the so-called incompetents, were now reproducing at the same rate as everyone else. Civilization, he wrote, was on the decline unless something was urgently done to stop it. Now, if most of this sounds like eugenics, and if it sounds like something America had done before, that's because it had. America at a certain point had implemented forced sterilization programs that had been legal in 27 American states, and this was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1927. And by the time they wound down, roughly 60,000 Americans had been sterilized against their will. The Nazis even studied American eugenics law when they drafted their own racial hygiene legislation in the 1930s. But that wasn't what Graham was proposing. He wasn't proposing forced sterilization. In fact, he was very careful not to mention that in his book. Because after the horrors of World War II, the whole ideology was too radioactive. So no, he was proposing what he called positive eugenics, where instead of eliminating the unfit for society, instead there was going to be the focus on multiplying the so-called gifted. And so what he was going to do was simply make it easier for the best human specimens to have more children. And he found this in the work of a Nobel laureate named Hermann Muller. Now, Hermann Muller is everything Graham is not. First, he was a genuine Nobel laureate. Secondly, he was a committed Soviet socialist who believed sincerely that the future of humanity depended on collective action. He also had a plan to save the human race. And his plan was just what Graham had been searching for. Since the 1930s, Muller had been arguing that humanity needed what he called a germinal repository, essentially a way to freeze the sperm of the world's greatest men and use it to level up the genetic floor of the species. His version was so comical that when he wrote personally to Joseph Stalin for assistance with the idea, Stalin declined. Yes, even Stalin, the man who secretly ran state breeding programs, found Muller's request too much. He called it an insult to Soviet womanhood. And so when Muller died in 1968, his repository was still just words on paper. And Graham found Muller's work while writing The Future of Man. And although Graham could not have been more different than Muller politically, he saw that Muller's idea was exactly what he had been searching for. And so when Graham opened his sperm bank in 1980, he named it the Hermann J. Muller Repository. repository, borrowing the credibility of a Nobel laureate who could no longer say whether he approved or not. The thing is, though, sperm banks were not new. They had been around since the 1950s, when scientists first worked out how to freeze and thaw human sperm without destroying it. And so by 1980, there were dozens of these operating across the United States. But the donors were anonymous. The doctors selected a donor that a patient would know almost nothing about, except maybe the eye color or the blood type. But Graham's was different in every way that mattered. For one, his donors weren't anonymous medical school students. They were, at least in theory, the greatest minds alive. Graham's plan was to stock the bank exclusively with sperm from Nobel laureates, which represented the greatest scientific minds alive. He would preserve the sperm and make it available to women smart enough to use them. And so he wrote letters and made calls. He even recruited at least 3 laureates to donate, and for the first time in the history of donor conception, women also got to choose. Graham would mail them a catalog of where the donors were listed by color-coded pseudonyms, with things like Mr. Fuchsia, who may be a tall, handsome Olympic gold medalist, and Mr. Gray White, who is a ruggedly handsome university professor who enjoys the classic. And so women read these descriptions and made their choice. And then Graham mailed the vials out packed in dry ice. Recipients would thaw them at home and perform insemination on themselves by timing this to their ovulation cycle. That was the plan, and they did all of this for less than $100. That was the Save Humanity master plan. When the Los Angeles Times broke this story in February of 1980, the country lost its mind. Ethicists appeared on every television network. The phrase master race turned up in the first paragraph of a dozen editorials. Late-night hosts made jokes and Senate offices received calls. And one of Graham's Nobel donors, who had so far kept his participation on the quiet, decided this was the moment to step forward publicly. His name was William Shockley, and his involvement will turn this whole thing from weird, perverted curiosity into something darker. William Shockley co-invented the transistor in 1947. He then went on to share the 1956 Nobel Prize in Physics for it, and he's one of the founding fathers of Silicon Valley. The device you're watching this video on exists partly because of what Shockley built in a New Jersey laboratory in the late 1940s. But by 1980, he was one of the most openly racist scientists in America. For over a decade, Shockley had been arguing publicly that Black Americans were genetically inferior and that the gap in IQ test scores between Black and white Americans was due to hereditary causes. He had also received nearly $1.5 million in grants from the Pioneer Fund, which was an organization that was founded in 1937 to promote white racial hygiene. And so when Graham announced that he was one of the sperm donors, it became very obvious that this was no longer a neutral scientific project. The other 2 Nobel laureates withdrew immediately, and the press, which had treated this whole thing as an eccentric curiosity, now had a very different story to tell. Graham insisted that he was not racist, and he said that the sperm bank is open to women of any background and tries to keep going without his Nobel laureate. But Graham needs new donors, and so he turns to academics and to Olympic athletes, men that he considers the next generation of greatness. And although the Nobel Prize Sperm Bank is still being called the Nobel Prize Sperm Bank, the Nobel component of it is gone. But all through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the bank quietly operates. The first baby, a girl named Victoria, is born on April 19th, 1982, and more babies follow. By the time Graham dies in February of 1997, the bank has produced 217 children by its own count. His successor was a businessman from Ohio named Floyd Kimball, who died the following year. And both their families decided to close the bank. The remaining samples were destroyed and all records sealed. And that might have been the end of it, except for a journalist named David Plotz. David was a staff writer at a state magazine, and in February of 2021, he published an open letter where he explained what the repository for Germinal Choice was and what had become of it. He asked anyone connected to contact him confidentially, and the next morning, emails start arriving, and they keep coming for 4 years. Letters from mothers who had never told their children how they were conceived, and donors who had spent years wondering whether they had biological children somewhere they would never meet. David tracked down half-brothers conceived from the same donor who had never known each other existed. He arranged children between children and the men whose DNA they carried. He also published the whole thing in 2005 as The Genius Factory. And his conclusion was that the children were not at all what Graham had promised. Some were exceptional, like a 14-year-old named Sam, who was breezing through college-level mathematics and seriously competing in athletics. Others were not. They ran roofing businesses, one was an opera singer, and others were other everyday folks. These were all recognizable, ordinary outcomes, not the generation of scientists and leaders that Graham had anticipated. And the child who had received the most attention was a young man named Doran Blake. Doran's mother was Afton Blake, a psychologist in California who had applied to the repository in the early 1980s. Her donor was listed only as Reg 28. She named her son Doran, Greek for gift. By 2, he was using a computer. By kindergarten, he was reading Hamlet and working through algebra. By 6, a tester estimated his IQ at about 180. So he was put in front of cameras repeatedly, from 60 Minutes to Japanese television to British tabloids. But when Plotz found him in college by 2001, he was far from what Graham would have expected. For one, he had no interest in science. He studied comparative religion. He later became a massage therapist. For him, intelligence was besides the point. What mattered was what you chose to do with your life, not where you started genetically. Doran famously quoted that I was his emblem. I was the boy with a high IQ who was not screwed up. I was his ideal result. But genes have never been important to me. Family is the people you love. Graham died when Doran was in high school, so he never found out what his ideal result chose to do with his life. What stood out about David's findings wasn't really about the children, it was about the mothers. The women who had sought out the repository were almost without exception driven, educated, and deliberate. Their children resembled them more than they resembled the donors, both in intelligence, curiosity, and drive. The environment that these mothers built was the variable that mattered the most. The sperm rarely did, which isn't surprising. Yes, intelligence is partly inherited, but inherited is not the same as guaranteed. Graham had assumed genius was a substance that you could extract from one person and inject into another. One of the people he had contacted, named Wald, said if Graham had wanted geniuses, he should have contacted people like his father, Wald said, who was a poor immigrant tailor from New York. Even though Graham's experiment failed on its own terms, he left something behind that had not been planned, because every modern sperm bank now offers a detailed donor profile, like a health history that covers education, a personal essay, a physical description, and all of this now operate on this model that Graham built. Before his repository for Germinal Choice, patients only received anonymous sperm that was chosen by their physicians. They had no say in the matter. But Graham's model now gave that choice to the mothers. And even though he may have wanted to engineer a better generation, what he produced was 200 ordinary lives and $100 million wasted on a wild goose chase that any of the mothers could have solved for free. If you found this interesting, subscribe for more videos like this on the history of medicine.